Thanks for joining us, everyone. You are watching the Case for a Climate Superfund, a regional webinar in support of Make Polluters Pay policies. We're getting started in about 30 seconds. I'm Victoria, CCAN's Virginia Director, and thrilled to be joined by experts and lawmakers that are leading the way on this issue. So as we get started here, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Mike Tidwell, CCAN's founder and executive director. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Vic, and thank you for everyone who's joined this webinar. This is the first ever regional webinar on the case for a climate superfund. We know that communities are being saddled with literally billions of dollars of climate impacts across our region and across the country, and there is growing momentum behind legislation to treat the situation that the world's largest oil companies knowingly created, basically turning our atmosphere into a Superfund site, and all the negative consequences are now being forced on communities to pay, and that's not right. A la tobacco, a la opioids, it's time for reform on this issue. I want to thank all the legislators from across the region that you're going to hear from and other experts. But first, I want to introduce our first speaker, a very close friend of mine and the legislative originator of this concept of a climate superfund, Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland, my U.S. Senator. He is a legislator who has never been afraid to take on powerful interests. I've known him since he was in the Maryland Senate. He spent over a decade in the Maryland General Assembly, was elected to Congress in 2002, and became soon the first legislator on Capitol Hill to introduce a bill to put a fee on carbon emissions and then take those revenues and rebate them to all Americans. Unfortunately, that bill did not pass, but fast forward to 2022, as President Joe Biden and Congress were working on the Inflation Reduction Act, Senator Van Hollen and advocates collaborated in introducing language, proposed language to be in the Inflation Reduction Act, which would use Superfund law, again, under this concept that the oil companies turned our atmosphere into a Superfund site, and therefore must pay into a fund to compensate communities as they adapt to those consequences. Unfortunately, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia at the time blocked this great idea from being part of the Inflation Reduction Act, but immediately afterwards, this really great idea with the precise legislative language created by Senator Van Hollen and his staff was picked up by states. And soon Vermont and New York passed versions of this bill, and now about 10 more states are in the legislative process of working toward passage, including Maryland, Virginia, and DC. So Senator Van Hollen, welcome to this regional webinar on this important issue, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mike. And let me just say at the outset, it's been great to work with you over the years on so many of these initiatives. And so to you and everybody who's part of CCAN, thank you. Thank you for working the local level, the state level, and the national level, to advance the cause of addressing the climate crisis and making sure that we provide for and invest in good paying jobs in the process. And I want to thank everybody who's on this call and part of the effort. I do want to thank the members of the Maryland legislature who have been on the lead on the Maryland version of Polluter Pays, and that's State Senator Katie Fry Hester, and in the House, I believe it was Delegate Hidalgo, but I think State Senator Hester is going to be on the call here a little later. So we're all gathered here because we believe in a simple but powerful principle, which is that polluters should pay to clean up the mess that they have made. And those who contributed the most to the mess should pay the most to help clean it up. That's the essence of this legislation. And we know we're at a critical juncture here in the fight against climate change and the climate crisis. The costs are escalating every day. We see rising sea levels, record temperatures, droughts, floods, and we're seeing people's insurance rates go through the roof. And in many cases, people can't get insurance at all. And then on the healthcare front, we're seeing escalated costs, whether it's in heart disease or asthma, which is estimated to cost the American people about $820 billion per year in medical bills. So the cumulative costs of climate change are huge. And so it's very important that we not turn to taxpayers to have to pick up the bill. We should turn to those who are most responsible. And that's why I introduced the Polluter Pays Climate Fund Act at the national level. The bill would target the biggest US-based fossil fuel extractors and oil refiners, as well as foreign-owned companies doing business in the United States. They'd be on the hook to pay about $1 trillion into the Polluter Pays Climate Fund at the national level. I should say the bill only applies to the heavy hitters. So these are fossil fuel companies responsible for at least 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions between the years 2000 and 2022. And each company's contribution to the fund would be directly proportional to the carbon emissions they produced over that period of time. So this would be a big step forward in providing the resources needed going forward. And I should say that it would have a very, very negligible, if any, impact on oil and fuel prices because we don't touch any of the medium and smaller size players. And so the competition in the market would assure that the prices don't go up as a result of these actions. What do we do with this federal Superfund? We help communities across the country build more resilient infrastructure so they're better prepared. We provide for disaster planning grants, and we support the communities that have borne the brunt and will continue to bear the brunt of the impacts from climate change. We set about 40% of the funds available for those purposes. Very importantly, for the purposes of this call, it does not preempt state laws or any lawsuits seeking accountability from big polluters. And that's really important because at this moment, of course, while we will continue to lay the groundwork for future federal action and federal action in Congress, we really need to count on all of you and folks at the state level to move this idea forward. As Mike mentioned, we've seen movement in Vermont and we've seen movement in New York, and there are other states around the country that are moving forward. In Maryland and Virginia, bills have been introduced. In Maryland, as you know, there was a study that was included in legislation, a demand for a study, mandate for a study that was vetoed, and we're in the process right now of finding a way to either to override the veto or otherwise implement that plan. I just talked to the comptroller of Maryland just about an hour ago about plans to move forward on that front. Let me just close with this by way of example. Mike mentioned a number of efforts we pursued in the past, including essentially putting a fee on carbon and rebating those funds. And I hope at some point at the national level we can return to that. But there's another very important story about how this whole process worked. And when I say this process worked, we first launched the idea of a green bank at the federal level back in, goodness, I can't even remember the exact year. I introduced a bill to create a national green bank around 2010, that time period. And we actually got a kernel of that idea passed as part of a House energy package more than 10 years ago. Unfortunately, that whole package died in the United States Senate. But what happened was that idea of creating a green bank did go local. And states around the country began to establish green banks or the equivalent of them, clean energy accelerators. They went by different names, but the idea was the same. It would be a pool of resources that could enter into public-private partnerships and otherwise invest in clean energy projects and energy efficiency projects around the country. And that idea proved successful where it was tried. And so a couple of years ago, Senator Markey and I teamed up. We introduced the updated version of what had been the National Green Bank legislation. It was the National Climate Bank, National Climate Fund. And we were able to incorporate that into the Inflation Reduction Act, which did pass about $20 billion worth of investment. Now, the Trump administration continues to hold that up. And so we're fighting them, including in court right now. But it is an example where an idea that started at the national level, and we didn't get it through at the national level when we first introduced it. It then went to the states, and the states passed legislation to prove the effectiveness of the idea. And then it came back to the federal level, and we did it on a nationwide basis. And so I'm very much hoping that is the story when it comes to the polluter pays initiatives. And I really look forward to working with all of you and keeping in touch, because I do think this is an area where your success at the state level and at the local level can then help us build momentum for another run at it at the federal level. So thank you. Thank you to CCAN. Mike, as always, it's good to be with you and your team. And we look forward to staying in regular communication as we move these through state legislatures in this region.
Thank you so much, Senator. We are so inspired and emboldened by all the work you've done at the federal level on climate, including on make polluters pay policies. And that has spawned a national movement. I want to pass it along to our friends at Fossil Free Media to talk a little bit about the growing national landscape on this issue.
Thank you. And I'm going to have to jump, but it's great to be with you all. All right, onwards.
Great. Thanks. We're going to roll with the slides. Perfect. Thank you. I'm Vicki Cimarrano. I'm with Fossil Free Media, and I'm working on their strategy with Make Polluters Pay and Climate Superfund. And just for the lay of the land, we are currently looking at 5 states with live legislation for Climate Superfund. That's California, Maryland, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Maine. And these states are continuing to build the public pressure for passage. You've heard about Maryland. I'm not going to go too much into that, but that's very current and live. But also New Jersey with a push in the lame duck right now in the coming weeks. And if that doesn't pass, there's certainly momentum with the new governor coming in and newly electeds for a reintroduction in the next session. So next year, we expect reintroductions and new legislation in 2026 and 27 in another 10 states. And then one of the things I'm just going to drop in the chat, which is a bunch of resources. Want to offer out that we have created a Climate Superfund resource hub with messaging, polling, research, cost information, ton of information for you all, and encourage you to sign up for that. Next slide. As you may have heard, working with our CCAN friends, we are launching a national week of action for Make Polluters Pay, and really just to call out the moment that we are in. I don't need to tell you all coming off of the Virginia elections, but affordability is top of mind. And as states are coming back into their legislative sessions in January, they're going to be facing crushing budget shortfalls. We know the federal government is pulling back on its funding for FEMA and NOAA to help with extreme weather events and disaster recovery. I mentioned affordability being top of mind. People's insurance costs are going up, electricity bills. And so just to call out this, we are in a different time and moment that we can be able to talk about innovative funding solutions that are relevant. And Climate Superfund is a real opportunity to push this. So the goals for the week of action are listed here. And really, it's to help set the narrative that states are leading in ways on for make polluters pay, like the senator just talked about, needing the states to elevate these issues, and really to empower you all with your voices and leadership to raise awareness, build political pressure towards these policy solutions and new funding for your communities. So next. We are looking at the last week of January. Here are the dates, 26th through 30th. And across the country, there'll be public events like press conferences, rallies. There's going to be art installations on climate disasters in state capitals. And we invite all of you to join in these events, either to do an action on your own, for legislators that are on the call, doing a floor statement, maybe a town hall this week, bringing in an impacted community, doing a press statement or op-ed. And we put together a legislator toolkit that is listed in this chat here for you to access to help you out and get started, as well as a partner toolkit as well. So next slide. So what can you do? You can sign up. There's a partner and a legislator sign up form in the link that I shared, and some of the links. And really, we're working with our CCAN friends to build these events. And I know that they are well in touch with all of you. But to get plugged in, there is a legislator Make Polluter Pay sign-on letter that we are encouraging to look at and sign on, and also just a website for you to take a look at. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Victoria. Really appreciate sort of that look at the national landscape on this issue. Now I do want to talk about the specific policies that we're advocating for in Virginia and Maryland. And first, I'm really excited to introduce our House patron for the Extreme Weather Taxpayer Relief Act in Virginia, also my delegate, so a double honor. And so I'm introducing Delegate Ray Cousins.
Thank you. Thanks, Victoria. And I just want to thank you and CCAN for organizing this very, very important discussion. I'm also happy to be on with, federal partners and regional legislators from Maryland, from the Maryland legislature. It's nice to know that we have partners in this fight. It felt pretty lonely last year with Senator Jennifer Boysko when we first introduced the Climate Superfund legislation here in Virginia. And so it's great to see movement in other states. It's great to see, again, movement and partners regionally and federally as well. I will say that here in Virginia, we are in the Commonwealth just facing more frequent and more damaging extreme weather from severe storms, flash floods, extreme heat, widespread power outages. We're seeing earlier snowfall here. We've had our second snowfall of the season already, and we are, not even at mid-December yet. We also saw this last year with Hurricane Helene, which inflicted billions of dollars of damage on families and small businesses and communities in Southwest Virginia. And we know that those communities still do not have the resources, even over a year later, that they need to fully recover. And it is families and small businesses that are left to pick up the pieces while our local governments here in Virginia struggle to fund recovery. And I just, I don't think it's fair that we keep asking Virginians to rebuild each disaster without changing the way that we fund relief and resilience. And right now, we know that the largest corporate emitters, the companies whose pollution significantly worsens climate-driven damage, those companies are paying none of the cost of the destruction that their emissions helped to create. And this legislation begins to address that. So again, the Climate Superfund legislation that I carried with Senator Jennifer Boysko here in Virginia last year did not make it out of committee, but we will continue to work on this in 2026 and just happy to be a partner in this fight and on this issue. So thanks again for having me today.
Thank you so much, Delegate Cousins. And yeah, thank you for acknowledging. I want to give a big thanks to Senator Boysko, who can't be with us here today, who is an excellent patron in the Senate in Virginia for this issue. Now I'll pass it along to our friends on the other side of the Potomac, Senator Hester, who I know has been an incredible advocate for this policy in Maryland. So Senator Hester's staff member, I believe, is here to represent her today. Bridget, if you want to join us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Sorry, got a thing that popped up. Thank you for having me. Thank you, CCAM, for putting this together. My name's Bridget O'Toole. I'm here on behalf of Senator Katie Freihuster. She's the Maryland Senate sponsor of the new act. She's really sorry she couldn't be here today, but she's really excited about the work we're doing and what's coming next. So just to start things off with where we are in the state, so as not to confuse anyone, a study version of the Renew Act passed with strong support in both chambers. However, it was ultimately vetoed by the governor early this year. So on Tuesday, we just learned we're heading into a special session, and we're really optimistic about an override. Because the bill was amended into a study, we really believe that will provide us with a strong legal footing, and this will matter as states begin to pursue climate Superfund models nationwide. So big picture, why now? Why Maryland? Why do we need this? Every year, Marylanders are facing mounting climate costs, tens of billions of dollars nationally and hundreds of millions right here at home. And just like everywhere else, it's taxpayers, not the companies that created the risk, who are footing the bill. So in Senator Hester's district, Ellicott City experienced 2 so-called 1,000-year floods in 2 years. Howard County has now spent more than $200 million on flood mitigation, including a massive 18-foot tunnel under Main Street. Annapolis is spending $88 million to protect City Dock. Our public schools face more than $700 million in air conditioning upgrades because extreme heat is making classrooms unsafe. These are real numbers showing up in today's budgets, and they contribute directly to Maryland's projected structural deficit, which we are talking about all the time in the State House. Meanwhile, the companies that knew for decades that they were contributing to the crisis have paid zero. So moving forward, a full Renew framework could shift these hundreds of millions in climate costs off of families and local governments and onto the fossil fuel companies that cause the harm. It will help fund flood resilience, protect schools and infrastructure, and relieve pressure on state and county budgets without raising costs for residents. Maryland is ready to lead with a fair, fiscally responsible, and legally defensible path forward. The study gets us there, and we're excited to see what happens on Tuesday.
Thank you so much, Bridget. Really appreciate you joining us. All right, now I want to move to explaining, how the law actually functions in practice, and very grateful to be joined by Amia from the Conservation Law Foundation, who have been an instrumental helper for organizations that are navigating sort of how to explain the legal mechanism for this policy. And so I will pass it off to her. Thanks again.
Thank you, Victoria. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm from the Conservation Law Foundation, and right now we are an intervener. So we're helping Vermont defend the Climate Superfund law in that state. So that's how our organization is involved there. And I wanted to just give a little bit more on the mechanics of how a Climate Superfund law works, and then also talk a little bit about the current stage of litigation in Vermont to get a sense of the types of challenges that what we think other states might face also. So as we've heard from my co-panelists, the Climate Superfund law really is the underlying principle of the Climate Superfund law is the polluter pay principle, or something that we learned back in kindergarten, right? We clean up after our mess. And overall, it creates a revenue-raising mechanism for the state to fund adaptation projects to address the impacts of climate change. So these are projects like upgrading water drainage systems and putting in cooling centers, weatherizing homes and buildings, raising seawalls. And these are funds that come from major fossil fuel companies paying their fair share of costs to the state. And because these costs will occur no matter what, now it's a matter of who's going to pay, the state through its residents or the companies most responsible for the harm causing harm causing emissions. And before the next slide, please. Before jumping into the mechanics of the actual Climate Superfund law, I wanted to give a brief overview of the original Superfund law, or also known as CERCLA, which is a Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, and the commonalities that it shares with the Climate Superfund law. So first, CERCLA, like the Climate Superfund law, imposes strict liability. That means it's liability without regard to fault. So that it's not necessarily that anyone intended to cause harm or that they were negligent in contributing to emissions that are now causing climate change. And the second aspect that is similar to the Climate Superfund law, is retroactive liability. This is liability for conduct that has happened in the past before the enactment of the governing statute, sort of when it was more or less unregulated in this particular manner. The next commonality is apportionment of liability, and this is where CERCLA and Climate Superfund laws differ a tiny bit. So the default in CERCLA liability is joint and several liability. That means all the defendants are on the hook for paying for the costs of environmental cleanup from hazardous waste release, which is and then if there is enough evidence to show that the harm can be divisible, where they can actually show that ABC company is responsible for 40%, okay, then they're only going to pay for 40% of those damages. But the Climate Superfund law starts right away. The cost recovery demands are tied to the responsible party's contribution to cover greenhouse gas emissions. So it's very specific to each company's contribution. And then the funds in CERCLA go to the cleanup of the costs, similar to how the funds in a Climate Superfund law would go to mitigating or preventing harms caused by climate change. The revenue raising mechanism of commonality. And how it works is similar to the Climate Superfund law. In CERCLA, there are what are called PRPs, potentially responsible parties. So these are the parties that either owned or operated the land from which the hazardous materials were released, or that they were somehow involved in transporting or arranging that material. And then finally, that the Superfund law hopefully as a good model for the Climate Superfund law challenges here are that they've survived several challenges under statutory and constitutional challenges. So namely under the substantive due process clause for retroactive liability, also under the procedural due process clause, and as well as the commerce clause in several federal circuits of appeals across the nation. Next slide, please. So how the Climate Superfund law works, in addition to the retroactive strict liability aspects, there are three kind of main parts that are going on here. First is the calculation of how expensive it is going to be for the state to pay for adaptation costs because of climate change. And we've seen two ways of doing this. One is legislatively determined, so it's right there in the statute. And this is the approach that New York has taken. So they came out with the $75 billion calculation, and they know, and that is in no way representative of the total cost, but that was just something that they wanted to put there in the statute. And that, that has its pros and cons, pros being that it's like a very specific number. The legislators kind of know this is the amount that we're dealing with. And then the other approach that we've seen in Vermont is the calculation of the climate change costs to the state is actually delegated to an agency. In Vermont, it was the state treasurer to actually do a little bit more nuanced calculation of the costs. And the second part of how the Climate Superfund law works is then that after that calculation, the actual total number of costs of the state is done, then comes the development of the cost recovery demands, which is what is actually issued by the state to the relevant fossil fuel entity. And so this is a function of two things. One is the responsible parties and the covered period. So the responsible parties are any fossil fuel company, basically any entity that during the covered period was responsible for extracting fossil fuels or refining crude oil and is found to be responsible for more than 1 billion metric tons of covered greenhouse gas emissions and has a jurisdictional nexus to that state. And the covered period is usually a 25-year period. We've seen 2000 to 2004, 1995 to the present. And this is the period that usually captures when these fossil fuel companies knew or should have known for sure that their activities were causing damage in the future with climate change. And how do we figure out the responsible parties based on the cover period? We rely on attribution climate science. So this is peer-reviewed scientific methods to determine the relevant responsible parties and how emissions are attributed to specific entities to help achieve that proportionate and fair share. So this kind of relies on the research that Richard Heady has done and the Carbon Majors report, which are some great resources. So just to see how this actually plays out in practice, let's take, for example, and these numbers are solely representative just to exemplify how this might work. So let's say the covered period is 2000 to 2024, and let's say there was a total of 100 billion metric tons of greenhouse gases emitted during that entire period by everyone. And the total cost to the state for climate change damages is $100 billion. So if XYZ oil company was responsible for 20% of those 100 billion metric tons of emissions, then it'll also pay 20% of the total $100 billion in damages, or $20 billion. So notably, the Climate Superfund law will not collect payments from every single fossil fuel company. So 100% of the costs may not be covered through cost recovery demands, but it will certainly help pay for a good amount, as opposed to it being on the public and the residents. And finally, the last part is the actual implementation of the climate change adaptation projects from the funds gathered through the cost recovery demands from the fossil fuel companies. And these are sometimes announced in the preamble of the statute. They're in the purpose of the bills. And then they also sometimes can be like listed out more specifically because they tag along with existing programs by the state to create adaptation projects. So the overarching language that we kind of see are these verbs right here: to avoid, moderate, repair, or adapt to negative impacts caused by climate change. And some examples that we've seen are, preparing or recovering from hurricanes, undertaking preventative healthcare programs, and upgrading parts of the electric grid to increase stability and resilience. Next slide, please. So currently, as I mentioned before, CLF is an intervener helping to defend the lawsuit against Vermont right now, which is I'll summarize here. So there's a lawsuit pending against Vermont for the Climate Superfund law. And there's 3 sets of plaintiffs. So the first group is the American Petroleum Institute and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The second group is West Virginia and 23 other red states, and the third plaintiff group is the United States and the U.S. EPA. So these are lots of big players, and their claims that they filed are kind of like a kitchen sink approach. They threw a lot of claims at the wall, some of which are also launched against CERCLA, which survived, and they're a mix of both constitutional and statutory claims. So statutory claims under the Clean Air Act, mostly dealing with preemption, saying that basically the Clean Air Act covers the conduct here. But that's actually kind of like the wrong framing, because climate superfund laws do not regulate emissions at all. So this is kind of similar to CERCLA. This is solely a revenue raising mechanism. In no way does it regulate the actual emissions. So similarly, CERCLA doesn't actually regulate how companies handle the hazardous waste, just the costs to clean up the release of hazardous materials. And the constitutional claims that the plaintiffs have put together are with respect to the Due Process Clause, Commerce Clause, Excessive Fines Clause, and the Takings Clause. So what Vermont and CLF did is we filed a motion to dismiss the plaintiff's lawsuit, saying basically, in other words, that the Climate Superfund law is completely valid under the statute and the Constitution, because first of all, on more procedural grounds that the plaintiffs lack standing. That means they don't have enough of a personal stake, because they're not the ones actually being called to pay. So why are they the right people to sue? And this is also a facial challenge, which means that they're trying to say the Climate Superfund law in no way works, in no way is constitutional, is no way lawful, and that is a much higher burden to be able to win on, as opposed to an as-applied challenge, which is a very specific application of the law. But the law hasn't actually been, there haven't been any cost recovery demands issued by the state, so that's why there's been a facial challenge. The other arguments are that with respect to due process, because there's no protected class implicated like race, the lowest tier of scrutiny applies to reviewing Vermont's Climate Superfund law. So all the court needs to do is find that the statute has a rational basis with a valid legislative purpose. This is an extremely deferential view, deferential to the state, that is, as opposed to when dealing with a statute that involves race. And here we meet Vermont meets that, because cost recovery is a rational means. It's rooted in science and process, and then raising funds for adaptation projects that will protect communities and their health and safety is a valid legislative process or purpose, excuse me. There are also pending summary judgment motions, which is basically a motion to file to win the case, get a favorable judgment without having to go to trial. And this is usually because there are no genuine issues of material facts. And here, this is a very low fact case. This is solely about how the law, the Constitution, applies or covers the Vermont Climate Superfund law. And this was filed by the plaintiffs, in this case, the folks who are challenging the law. And they sort of it was more of a response to the motion to dismiss, but they also seem to be fairly confident that they're going to win on the merits with respect to their legal arguments. And earlier this year, so this lawsuit was filed late in December in 2024. The U.S. also has since filed a similar case against New York this year on similar grounds. And that's it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the thorough explanation of some of the legal mechanisms here. So just, that it is a very complicated story, but it boils down to there's significant precedent for doing retroactive cost recovery for damages. And that is the basic principle of the polluters pay policies. So if you're thinking about the major polluting companies in the 80s responsible for Superfund sites, they did not intend to cause damages, but they did. And so therefore it is their responsibility to recover those damages. And it's within the authority of the state to make those cost recovery demands. Really appreciate it. Not surprisingly, people are struggling with basic costs right now, and states are struggling to balance how they can meet people's pressing needs. So this is a popular policy. We're making room in state budgets to be able to fund other programs by making sure that the entities responsible for damages are the ones paying it and not taxpayers through state budgets. And so I want to pass it back to Fossil Free Media to talk about some polling on this policy, which demonstrates just how well it resonates with the general public.
Yeah, thanks so much, Victoria, and thanks everyone for being here. My name's Cassidy DiPaola. I'm the communications director at Fossil Free Media, as well as the communications director for the national Make Polluters Pay campaign. I'm going to go through these slides very quickly so we can have some time for a Q&A at the end of this. But they will be, they're all made public and available for you as well as this slideshow. And I'll also start by saying the majority of the slides and poll in this presentation was done in August of 2025. So it's very recent. And we did a national poll with oversamples in a few different states across the country. And one of those states was Virginia. So this kind of is a little bit more focused for Virginia, but it does speak to the national landscape as well. And I will say that Virginia reflects positively what the rest of the United States is feeling, and I feel as though it can be applied to Maryland and DC and others in our region. But to get started, what we can see is that across our region, as well as across the country, people really are no longer viewing climate change as this distant threat. Nationally, nearly half of voters say that they or someone they know has personally experienced extreme heat in just the past few years. And in Virginia specifically, those numbers are even higher. So we know, and our takeaway from this is that voters really do see climate impacts as a part of their everyday reality. Next slide. I apologize again for going through this slightly quickly. But as Victoria mentioned, people are really expecting climate change to hit their wallets, and they're feeling it now. So the next thing that stood out to us is how clearly, surprisingly almost, people are able to connect climate impacts to rising costs. So nationally, a majority of voters expect climate change to affect their household finances in the coming decade. And then in Virginia, that number is actually even more striking. And we see that 59% of voters expect direct financial impacts. They're starting to see this link between extreme weather and the price of things like groceries, utilities, repairs to their home. And I think all of us know, and especially from the recent election, affordability is very much front and center for voters right now. And we're actually seeing that many voters already are starting to understand what's driving up their costs, and climate change being one of those things. Next slide. Senator Van Hollen actually alluded to this earlier, but one of the clearest ways that people experience these rising costs is through insurance. So we found that 84% of voters nationally say that they're worried about home and property insurance increasing in the coming years. And that concern is bipartisan. We see it strong across Democrats, independents, and Republicans. And so, for families in Maryland and DC, Virginia, these are all flood prone areas. They're, heat stressed areas. Insurance hikes are one of the most visible and unavoidable signs of climate change that's hitting household budgets. And so, I will just say it's up to us to make sure that voters know that when they're concerned about rising costs of insurance, we really need to make that connection that it's climate change that's making these costs go up because they readily do believe that their costs are going up. Next slide. This is actually another slide that surprised us, and this was a national poll from a bit earlier in 2025. But in this poll, we asked people, who do you think is driving prices up, or who do you expect, what industry do you expect to kind of drive up prices for the sake of their profit? And we did use the word greed in this question. And we were sort of shocked, but oil and gas companies top the list of industry. I mean, obviously, I'm not shocked because I know that the fossil fuel industry is, profiteering, but even higher, to see this as even higher than pharmaceutical and healthcare corporations is, I think, a big deal. And so we see that 60% of Republicans believe that oil and gas companies top this list of voters, of what voters believe raises prices just to increase profits. And, I think that voters really do see or at least are starting to see a connection between corporate behavior and pressure on our own budgets. When corporations are bad actors, we as voters and as Americans are the ones that pay the price. And so, we're starting to see that voters across our region really do understand that big oil is profiting while our small businesses and our families are paying much more. Next slide, please. And so because of all of this, which I've just outlined quickly, we're actually seeing that support for Make Polluters Pay, the message broadly in this campaign broadly, is very strong. Nationally, 74% of voters support the idea of requiring oil and gas companies to pay a share of climate damages that they cause. So we ask this question as just, do you think oil and gas companies should pay a fair share for the damage that they cause? And you can see right here that it's fairly strong across every demographic and political group, of course, most heavily amongst Democrats. And then narrowing in and zooming into Virginia particularly, Virginia really does mirror these national numbers almost exactly. And that tells us that voters in our region, likely in Maryland as well as in DC, are, I would even say are fully aligned with this broader push for accountability. Next slide, please. And what we asked as a follow-up was about, the price tag. And we saw that support grows when voters hear the price tag. Yes, perfect, this slide. So when people learn the scale of the cost that we're dealing with, support gets even stronger. So we said, and we cited this really kind of explosive Bloomberg article that climate-related extreme weather costs are costing the United States about $1 trillion every year. And it cost the US $1 trillion last year, though we know that's a very small number. It's a conservative number. We know it's really much higher than that. But when we use that 1 trillion and say most of it's paid by taxpayers, the support jumps to 79%. So it's as communicators, we really need to make that price tag clear, because when the price tag is clear, the solution, being climate superfund bills and the Make Polluters Pay campaign at large, also becomes clear to voters. Next slide. And so we started by asking them generally, do you support the idea of fossil fuel companies paying a fair share? And then we got even more granular. So we asked specifically about climate superfund proposals. And when we asked about Superfund specifically, Virginia became one of the strongest states in the entire poll. 79% of Virginians support specifically climate superfund legislation. And we asked in two different ways, whether we framed it, we asked if this helps communities, and then we also used the framework of this is a cost sharing mechanism. Both ways, any way you really describe it, it's highly popular. And as you can see, it's also higher than many of the other states that we surveyed. So, nationally, Climate Superfund does really well, polls really well. And then in Virginia specifically, it really does stand out as a place where voters are especially ready for this policy. And then just one more slide. Lastly, this is a winning political issue. So I know that we have legislators on the call. I hope that you feel empowered by this. And then also to advocates, I hope that you take this polling and go to people that you know that are holding office or even interested in running on a Superfund policy and show them this. So we see that 64% of voters say that they're more likely to support a candidate who backs climate superfund legislation, and only 15% say that they're less likely. And this is really consistent with what we see nationally as well. So for Maryland, for DC, and Virginia leaders, this is definitely good policy. We know that, but it's also good politics. Voters want their elected officials to stand up for families. They want their elected officials to make polluters pay their fair share. Now is the time to do it. So I will end there, but I'm going to share my email in the chat and just say that we have so much polling across the region and across the country. And so please do reach out if you're interested in hearing more, or go to our website, makepolluterspay.net, and all of our polling is up there as well. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Cassidy. Really appreciate it. Yeah, we're seeing incredible support across the region in our specific states and across the country for this movement. So really appreciate getting to delve into the numbers a little bit. With our remaining time, I want to briefly touch on sort of next steps in our respective regions. We're also joined here on the CCAN front by Claire, who's working in DC on a new initiative. So I'm going to start actually with Brittany from Maryland to talk about where we are with the Renew Act and how folks can help. Oh, Claire, I've got you on. So let's start with Claire.
Okay, sure. Hi, y'all. I'm Claire. I'm our campaigns manager here in DC. And yeah, really excited that we have launched our campaign to make polluters pay in the district. We launched our coalition and campaign in October. We already have almost 500 DC residents signed on to our petition in support of making polluters pay. And we're using all of that momentum to really get going in the new year. We hope in the new year we will be introducing the first phase of our legislation here, a polluters pay study bill, where we will figure out all of the details of how climate change is going to impact the district, and use that to help us establish this climate superfund here. So we're excited for introduction in the new year, and throwing it back to the January week of action that's happening all across the country. We will be doing a great action here in DC to build excitement as we get this campaign really rolling in 2026. So we're very excited for what's to come next year.
Thank you, Claire. All right, friends on the other side of the Potomac, Brittany.
Yes, so excited in Maryland. As Bridget already alluded to, we have a special session coming up next Tuesday. And so we're really excited because we've been building power over the summer and really supporting constituents to dialogue with legislators to bring some of what fossil-free media has just shared with us to life. Constituents really care about this bill. Other organizations really care about this bill. So spotlight on Maryland. All of us are looking forward to a veto override of our climate cost study. Once that veto is overridden, then the comptroller will start the work to figure out the costs of climate change in Maryland. That work should wrap up around December 2026. Hopefully teeing up an implementation bill for the 2027 legislative session. So things are moving quickly here in Maryland as well, but we're really excited because we have a strong group behind us.
Thank you, Brittany. And I'll close us out for Virginia. Our legislative session starts January 14th and moves very quickly, ending on March 14th. So that means we have a very limited window to mobilize at the General Assembly building. In the Senate, we expect this to be heard by the Senate Agricultural and Natural Resources Committee. In the House, we expect to be heard first in a subcommittee of Labor and Commerce. So those are the first lawmakers we need to engage and Currently, CCAN is organizing sit-down meetings as well as virtual meetings between constituents and lawmakers that are ongoing right now. So if you want to get plugged in, I will be putting a link in the chat where you can sign up. If you're an advocate, you can also join us for our climate rally in Richmond on January 21st, where we'll be highlighting a whole package of legislation that we are going to be advocating for this session. We have a couple of volunteer phone banks coming up, and we also have a climate lobby day coming up on February 17th in Richmond. If you're on CCAN's list, you'll get plenty of additional opportunities to take action. But again, here I will put in the chat is our link to indicate what you are interested in Virginia.